Good morning, class. Today we're going to be reviewing material on the second part of the book chapter on neuroscience and behavior, and we're going to begin by talking about the nervous system and the endocrine system, which are the two major communication systems that we have in our body. The nervous system is a system that includes up to 1 trillion linked neurons that are organized in a very complex way. And it's one of the primary intercommunication networks that we have in our body. Now, the nervous system is divided into two sections, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, which we are about to discuss in more detail. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And because they're important for your functioning, the body has found ways to protect it. So for instance, the brain and the spinal cord are both surrounded by bones. The brain is surrounded by the skull, and then the spinal cord is surrounded by the spinal column. In addition to the protection given by the bones, we also have layers of tissue called the meninges, and then we also have both the brain and the spinal cord suspended in cerebrospinal fluid, which again helps them against any kind of damage. Now, the central nervous system is important in our experience of everything. And the way this happens is through the sensory receptors we have in our spinal cord. Wherever experiences we have on the outside world, they're all sent through the spinal cord. They're sent up to the brain, and then the brain sends messages down through the spinal cord and then outside to our muscles. So you see a lot of activation from sensory receptors as well as the motor neurons as well. And we have certain reflexes that can happen without the involvement of the brain, such as the spinal reflexes. And we're about to see an example of how those reflexes work. A spinal reflex is a simple involuntary behavior that is processed in the spinal cord without brain involvement. And here we have an example of someone stepping on Legos, feeling that pain, and then moving the feet away. Now, what happens here is that first we have skin receptors detecting the pain and sending this message through sensory neurons. The sensory neurons are going to carry the message all the way down to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, then we will have interneurons that are going to relay this message to motor neurons, which is going to activate that withdrawal reflex. That's when you move your feet. However, at the same time that it sends the message to move your feet, it also sends the message all the way up to your brain to communicate that this is a painful experience. Now, again, you can see that both of these things happen simultaneously. You send the message up, or the spinal cord sends the message up to the brain to classify it as painful. You need to move, but it also does it already without. It doesn't wait for the brain necessarily to react. It reacts without the involvement of the brain. And the reason why this happens is because even though it might take a few more seconds to let the message travel to the brain, have the brain decide what happens, those few seconds can really make a difference between, making big damage to your body versus maybe not making such a big damage in your body, right? So in this case, you stepped on a Lego, maybe that's as far as the damage would go, but for instance, if you're touching something hot, those extra seconds can make a really big difference. So this is why we have these involuntary behaviors or these reflexes, which are meant to protect us against, again, any bigger dangers before the brain has any opportunity to assess the situation in general. The second subdivision of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, which is comprised of all the nerves outside of the central nervous system that extend to the outmost body borders, including your skin. The peripheral nervous system has two subdivisions. We have the somatic nervous system, which communicates sensory information to the central nervous system and motor messages from the central nervous system to the muscles. We also have the autonomic nervous system, which regulates involuntary functions such as your heartbeat, blood pressure, breathing, and digestion. The autonomic nervous system is based on efficiency. So if you were to have to be thinking consistently about, well, I have to breathe, I have to breathe, I have to breathe, and then I have to breathe, your brain wouldn't have any other capacity to focus on anything else, right? You would really have to be focused on breathing for you to breathe. So the autonomic nervous system, again, is based on this efficiency of keeping up the basic functions of your body going without you putting any mental effort into making those things happen. The autonomic nervous system has two branches that help control these involuntary functions. We have the sympathetic nervous system and we have the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is your body's emergency response, and it's based on how you spend energy. This is specifically important in the regulation of the fight or flight response. So if you are in any kind of danger, it is the sympathetic nervous system that gets your body ready to make that flight. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is kind of the opposite. It's a system that is focused on conserving energy, and it calms your body. It makes your body return back to normal. Now, again, both of these systems are opposite to each other, but we need both of them to function properly, and they help keep the nervous system in a balance. In this table, we can see different body parts, and it's telling you how the sympathetic nervous system will make those body parts react, or what is the response given when the sympathetic nervous system is engaged versus what is the response given when the parasympathetic nervous system is engaged. And what you can see is, again, overall across these different body parts, you'll see that energy is expended in the sympathetic nervous system because of that flight or fight response that we have, and then in the sympathetic nervous system is more focused on conserving that kind of energy, again because the body's response is more about resting and digesting. So for instance, in the case of the heart, we can see that in the sympathetic nervous system it's going to increase that heart rate, which requires energy, versus in the parasympathetic nervous system, we're going to see a decrease in this heart rate, again, kind of conserving this energy. And then here we can see the overall organization of the nervous system. Again, the nervous system is divided into two big sections, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of the brain and your spinal cord. On the other side, we see the peripheral nervous system, which is further divided into other sections. We have first the somatic nervous system and then the autonomic nervous system. And as we just discussed, the autonomic nervous system also has two subsections, which we call the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. I think overall you should definitely know the breakdown of the nervous system, because that is something that you would definitely see in your exam, and you should have a general idea of what each system or subsystem purpose is in the body. The endocrine system is not part of the nervous system, but it interacts with it in important ways. The endocrine system is made up of glands that are located throughout the body, and it uses chemical messengers, which we call hormones, to transmit information. Now, hormones are triggered by the brain, for example, the hypothalamus, which we'll discuss in detail later, and it's circulated by blood. Now, hormones can be almost identical to neurotransmitters that we discussed in our prior class, and they help regulate physical processes, and they also influence behavior. So for example, they regulate our growth rate, or they could also regulate our sexual development. And they can be influenced by our emotions and stress. In this figure, you can see the location and main functions of several important endocrine glands. Some of this we're about to discuss in more details, but here is a good depiction again of those different sections or locations in your body that are releasing certain hormones that are making your body react in certain ways. The pituitary gland is a pea-sized gland just under the brain that regulates the production of other hormones by many of the glands in the endocrine system, and it's activated by the hypothalamus. Again, the pituitary gland may control the hormone release of other glands in the body that we saw in the previous image, but it can also release some hormones that can act directly into the body. For instance, the pituitary gland can release a growth hormone that stimulates normal skeletal growth during childhood. It can also release prolactin, which stimulates milk production in nursing mothers, and it can also release oxytocin, which is involved in the reproduction, social motivation, and social behavior. The adrenal glands produce hormones involved in human stress response, so they play a key role in the fight or flight response, and when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, they activate the adrenal glands for the production of epinephrine and norepinephrine to get the body ready for that response. Now we're changing focus to what the book calls a guided tour of the brain, where we're going to be learning about different sections of the brain and its functions, as well as some important facts that you need to know about your brain. An important fact for you to know about your brain is its remarkable capacity to change in function and structure in response to experience, something we call neuroplasticity. There's two forms of neuroplasticity that may happen in your brain. The first one is called functional plasticity, which is your brain's ability to shift functions from damaged to undamaged brain areas. The second one is the structural plasticity, which is your brain's ability to change its physical structure in response to learning, active practice, or environmental influences. This slide and the next slide are focused on different imaging techniques that we use to understand the brain. I do want you to have a general understanding of each one of these imaging techniques. You can find more details in your book. However, for today's lecture, I'm mainly going to focus on the difference between functional imaging techniques and structural imaging techniques, which is what I will test you on your exam. Now, the main difference between the functional imaging techniques and the structural imaging technique is that the functional ones are focused on understanding what is happening and how it's happening, versus the structural imaging techniques are focused on where something is happening. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, I'm not going to focus so much on the details for each one of these imaging techniques. However, you should review this material in your book. But again, I just want you to understand the main difference between why do we use functional imaging techniques and why do we use structural imaging techniques. Likewise, you should be able to identify which of these imaging techniques are functional and which of them are structural for your exam. And you should also be familiarized with some of the limitations of these techniques. This may also be a question in your exam. So please make sure you understand that sometimes these brain imaging techniques may not really increase our understanding of real-time human behavior. They may also not really tell us how a particular brain area is going to respond to everyone, because everyone has different experiences, and again, how the imaging of a particular behavior can be interpreted differently depending on the context in which that specific behavior is happening. Okay, so now we're going to begin talking about the different parts of the brain and its functions, and we're going to start with the brainstem, which includes the hindbrain and the midbrain, which are located at the base of the brain. In this image, we can see the hindbrain and the midbrain. So the hindbrain is going to be in the blue colors, and the different sections that compose the hindbrain are also labeled here as well. We can also see the forebrain. The forebrain is something we're also going to be discussing, but we're going to be discussing that a little bit later. However, this is a good image to refer to if you want to learn about some of the major regions of the brain. Remember that the hindbrain is at the base of the brain, so the hindbrain is what is going to connect the spinal cord with the rest of the brain. And the hindbrain is composed by three major structures. First, we have the medulla, which controls vital life functions such as breathing and circulation. We also have the pons, which connects the medulla to the cerebellum, or the two sides of the cerebellum, and it also helps with the coordination of movement on each side of the body. Lastly, we have the cerebellum, which is a two-sided structure at the back of the brain, and this part of the brain is going to be responsible for muscle coordination and maintaining posture and equilibrium. So when someone drinks alcohol, this is one of the brain areas that are affected, which is why when people are drunk, they are having a hard time keeping balance. We also have the reticular formation, which is a network of nerve fibers that are located in the center of the medulla. The reticular formation is important for the regulation of attention, arousal, and sleep, and is composed of many specialized cell groups that project up to higher brain regions and down the spinal cord. The midbrain is considered to be an important relay station. We receive some of the information through the midbrain, and then it's transported to other regions of the brain, such as the forebrain, which we will discuss shortly. But mainly the midbrain receives information that has to do with auditory and visual sensory information. So it's going to be the part of the brain that's going to help you adjust to your surroundings, specifically, again, those sights and sounds. The forebrain is the largest and most complex brain region, and it includes the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. In this image, you can see the different structures of the limbic system, which we're about to discuss. Specifically, the limbic system is a group of four brain structures that form a border around the brainstem and are involved in emotions, motivation, learning, and memory. Within the limbic system, we have the hippocampus, which is a large forebrain structure that is part of the limbic system and embedded in the temporal lobe in each cerebral hemisphere. Now, the hippocampus has an important role in learning new memories of events or new information. We also have the thalamus, which is a rounded forebrain structure located within each cerebral hemisphere. The thalamus is important for the processing of sensory information, except for smell, and it distributes motor information and sensory information going to and from the cerebral cortex. So here we have the thalamus, and again, almost all sensory and motor information going to and from the cerebral cortex is processed through the thalamus. So in this image, you can see the different neural pathways from different regions of the thalamus to specific lobes of the cerebral cortex. We have already discussed the hypothalamus very briefly in the endocrine system, but again, the hypothalamus is a small structure located below the thalamus. It contains more than 4 neural pathways, and again, it helps the pituitary gland, and it regulates both the autonomic nervous divisions. We also have the amygdala, which is a cluster of neurons at the base of the temporal lobe. It's involved in a variety of emotional responses. It also helps people detect any threatening stimuli, and it also has a role in forming memories, especially those memories that have a strong emotional component. The cerebral cortex is the wrinkled outer portion of the forebrain. It contains the most sophisticated brain structures, and it's composed mainly of glial cells and neural cell bodies. Now you may hear people talk about the gray matter or the white matter in the brain. The gray matter is going to be any neuron cell body that's unmyelinated, versus white matter is going to be myelinated. We also have the cerebral hemispheres, which are nearly symmetrical. So you will never find two halves that are identical. They're not perfectly symmetrical. One or the other will always be somewhat bigger. And then we have the corpus callosum, which is a thick band of axons that connects the two cerebral hemispheres and acts as a communication link between them. Here you can see more clearly the two different cerebral hemispheres, and you can see how they're connected by the corpus callosum. Each hemisphere of the cerebral cortex can be divided into 4 regions, which we call lobes. Each lobe is associated with distinct functions. So for instance, the occipital lobe is an area at the back of each cerebral hemisphere that is primary receiving area for visual information. Here you can also find the visual association cortex, which helps give meaning to the visual information that we are receiving. We also have the parietal lobe, which is an area on each hemisphere of cerebral cortex located above temporal lobe that processes body sensations. The somatosensory information that it processes includes touch, temperature, pressure, and receptor information in muscles and joints. It also has the primary somatosensory cortex, which receives information from touch receptors in different parts of the body. Here we can see a visual support for how the body's representation happens in the somatosensory cortex and the primary motor cortex. And if body parts were proportional to the representation or their representation on the somatosensory cortex and primary motor cortex, they would look like the misshapen hemifigures on the outer edges of these drawings. So depending on the body part, more information is going to be received from those specific areas. We also have the temporal lobe, which is an area on each hemisphere of cerebral cortex near the temples. That is the primary receiving area for auditory information. It also has an association cortex, which allows us to give meaning to the auditory stimuli that we receive. So for instance, this association cortex is what will help your brain to recognize the difference between a musical note and a baby's cry. We also have the frontal lobe. This is the largest lobe of each cerebral hemisphere, and it processes voluntary muscle movements. It also has an association cortex called the primary motor cortex. And then we also have the prefrontal cortex, which is going to be very important in thinking, planning, and emotional control. And here we have an image with the different lobes labeled on the brain. We also have on the right side the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex label, as well as the primary auditory cortex and the primary visual cortex. You should probably know or be familiar with both of these images for your exam.